welcome to all of our new members, our current members, our new board members, and we're really excited to have shared what we've done over the past year. And now we're going to move into our spring education series, or presentation, I should say, which will be on the essentials of artificial intelligence for nursing, which will be presented by Kathleen McGrow. And I just wanted to share that Kathleen McGrow serves as the Chief Nursing Information Officer for Microsoft Health and Life Sciences. In this role, she advises organizations on how to use the innovative use of technology, on how the innovative use of technology can support their digital transformation imperatives of consumer engagement, provider enablement, analytics for population health, and cognitive computing to support a learning health system. Her expertise in data analytics and artificial intelligence is used to educate organizations on how to enhance clinical, operational, and financial performance, maximize capacity and patient experience, and transform to new care models and paradigms. She has led, planned, and directed programs and strategic initiatives for organizations, including implementation of an evidence framework for best practices. She has published 2 articles about artificial intelligence. Both are written to engage strategic thinking about current and future use of AI for clinical use cases and improve patient outcomes. Her experience includes engaging with a variety of C-suite executives, providers, meaning clinicians, and care managers, as well as a geographically diverse team of clinical and technical experts. Prior to working at Microsoft, she has held positions at GE Healthcare, Caradigm, which was a Microsoft and GE company, and Philips. Her clinical background spans many years, with most of that time spent in trauma and clinical care settings. Dr. McGrow has worked at some of the premier medical centers in the United States, including Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland Shock Trauma Center. She is a graduate of the University of Maryland with a doctorate in nursing practice focused on executive leadership and evidence-based practice. And with that introduction, I just would like to provide a special prior to her launching, I would like to provide a special thanks to our joint provider, Boston Children's Hospital. I have already introduced our guest speaker, Kathleen, and Dr. McGrow. I'm very excited to hear what she has to say today. And then just to do the informal or formal disclosure that this speaker has no conflicts of interest to disclose. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and go ahead and let Dr. McGrow continue on.
Thanks, Emily. You can call me Kathleen. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Thanks. Please call me Kathleen. It is really okay. Although I will tell you a very funny story. That was a long introduction. So as I'm is there anything I need to click special in order for you guys to hear some videos on here when I get to them?
I don't think so.
Okay.
I don't think so, yeah.
All right, so we'll see what happens. I do have a very funny story. That was a very long intro, and I apologize for that. I could have trimmed that down. I thought Mary Kennedy was going to trim that down for me.
It was too good.
Well, I'm honored to be here.
It was well deserved.
I have a very funny story. I was doing a podcast with a medical doctor, a physician, myself and a technical person, and the moderator actually asked the physician, how would you like to be addressed? And the physician said, you can call me doctor on the introduction. And then after that, feel free to call me by my first name. And then he just kept going. And I said, excuse me, let me just ask, can you also call me doctor on the introduction? And he did, Dr. Groves did say, there's some credibility there when you introduce someone as, with their doctoral, your credentials. And I just thought it was funny. And I couldn't decide, was it because I was the female on the podcast? Was it because I was the nurse? So there was this assumption that I didn't have my doctorate degree. So, we need to speak up for ourselves as nurses. And I think that's a good example of it. So thank you so much for having me today. I would like this to be conversational. There's a lot of information. I'm just going to frame this up. If if you're thinking, how did a nurse start to talk about artificial intelligence? And I ran into a lot of C-suite nursing executives that actually asked me very basic questions around artificial intelligence. What's the difference between AI and clinical decision support? And are my nurses using AI now and I don't realize it? Or, how can we understand this AI better? So, for me, I really was looking for a way to educate, in general, educate nurses in, what are the questions that we should ask and what do we need to know when we're working with these systems. And you're using AI every day because you have a telephone and you're using the conversational AI when you click on that button and you say, Siri, give me directions or whatever. So anyway, so you heard my introduction. Happy to share the articles that I wrote because I think that I really wrote them for you as an audience, and I'd love to get feedback. And if somebody wants to continue, authoring, I think that it would be great. I'm honored to be here, so I really appreciate your time. Mary, please keep me honest on my timing too. Make sure we leave enough time for questions because I'm happy to answer any and all questions. I'm really excited. This is a great group. It's a really good group of people here. So just very briefly, the learning outcomes, these are kind of some mandatory slides that, I put in up front, and then the objectives really, that I'm going to cover off on today. And hopefully I meet all of your needs. But please let me know if you do have questions. Happy to answer them if I can at all. I am obviously not a technical person. I'm trained as a nurse. I was sticking my finger in a bullet hole before I decided to go into nursing informatics. So, I'll go from there. I usually like to start about just, any new technology can be disruptive. And I'm going to throw it out there. Feel free to come off of mute if you would like to ask, what was Dr. Forbes talking about? And he said in 1821, that it will ever come into general use, notwithstanding its value, I am extremely doubtful because its beneficial application requires much time and gives a good deal of trouble both to the patient and the practitioner, and because its whole hue and character is foreign and opposed to all of our habits and associations. Any thoughts or ideas of what it could be? It looks like there's somebody in the chat maybe. Nobody?
Stethoscope.
Stethoscope, that's correct. Can you imagine not having the stethoscope today? So we have to realize that we have to be disruptive, and new technology is going to be disruptive. And we really need to understand that this is a ubiquitous device in healthcare today, and we're going to become that with AI. We're going to see that AI is going to be prevalent throughout our practice, our clinical practice. So we need to be aware of that, and we need to be ready for that when it comes down. I obviously do work for Microsoft. We at a very high level within our organization, our CEO believes that artificial intelligence is really going to be very impactful to healthcare. We need to harness the data. We need to reimagine healthcare. We need to be able to improve the health of populations and ultimately help save lives. And that really starts by understanding a well-defined problem. So for me, it's all about problems and solutions. It's not about products at all. I'm really trying to better understand, how can we leverage, a diverse set of disciplines. So when we bring in the technology folks, when we bring in computer science with us as clinicians, especially as nurses, how can we really solve the problems that we're trying to solve? And I really believe that if you can take and analyze the massive amounts of data and bring them into the cloud, because a lot of this is cloud computing dependent, because we need to have the opportunity to extract that new knowledge. And that could really be the positive differentiator for what we're doing for our patients. So we'll be able to empower the healthcare teams. We'll be able to improve those operational outcomes. We'll be able to improve care coordination and really be able to personalize care. So we actually leverage and talk about the Quintuple Aim. I don't know if anyone has within your organization, if you do the Quadruple Aim. We know the Triple Aim started with Dr. Bodenheimer, and then the Quadruple Aim, they kind of added that clinician experience. And now they've actually, in 2021, there actually has been a lot of discussion around the Quintuple Aim, and that really pulls out health equity. So when you have a big mission, you have to have a really good strategy. So it's really all about enabling enabling care through technology, health promotion, and disease prevention. We had a lot of discussions around this quintuple aim. We were really, trying to pull out health equity. As a nurse, I do not feel that I had implicit bias, but maybe I did, and I didn't realize that when I was a care provider. So we really want to identify and pull out this idea of health equity and health equity for all, and really identifying that as the fifth aim so that we really understand it and we really make sure that we address it to ensure that we address those social determinants of health. So the quintuple aim, we believe, is really the single best path in order for technology to create the new value of the emerging value-based care model. So we know we're moved from that fee-for-service to value-based care. Because the quintuple aim is really going to define that value in the value-based care. So that way we can kind of drive digital transformation within our industry to understand and digitize the system, not as it exists today, but really transforming it and using that technology to scale and solve the really big systematic problems. And we really realize that these problems are huge and we need to better understand them to solve them. So we've worked with very many organizations on digital transformation. We know that those that are most successful, it's a journey, and they understand that it's a process through that journey. And I believe that digital transformation is really people, process, and technology. It's really that triangle. And if you move one, you have to move the other to kind of adjust to it. But we really need to have a clear vision. We need to have a strategy. We need to understand the unique potential and the capabilities, and those are foundational elements in order to really turn to the technology to understand it. So technology is the tool, people are the focus, and then the more value is the outcome. So, why are we talking about this now? Why are we talking about AI? AI is not new. We've been on this journey for decades, really, to augment human capabilities. The first calculators, if you think about it, that could do better with humans, even with mechanical options like the Grant calculator in 1877. Electronics really opened up a new frontier for artificial intelligence. Natural experiences like Voter, it's a machine that can mimic human voice, and then the first attempts on reasoning machines. And then computers really bringing the GUI, the graphical user interfaces, and voice recognition for self-driving cars as early as 1994. But we're talking about this now really because there's so much that's going on around these powerful algorithms, the compute, and the big data. So it's really these three things. So we have more data than we ever had before. I think someone said the other day, like, we double our data, in minutes now versus in hours. And we know within electronic health records, it used to be like so many months, so many days, and now we're into the hours. There's just so much data. And since we're able to capture and store more data about how our machines perform, about our patients, we're better able to store it, to process it. So the more data I have, the more accurate a model that I can go ahead and I can build. The second thing is that I've got a ton more compute power available and lots of different options around compute. And one of the amazing things about the cloud is that you can rapidly go and you can deploy a large number of machines or a small number of machines, and you can change the economics of deploying that workload. So I can spin up a machine, I can actually just use it for a few hours, and then I can, essentially decide whether I'm going to continue with that machine or not. Sorry, I kind of flipped through there. And finally, there's been a ton of innovation in algorithms and tools and the frameworks over the last 10 years. And this is really happening because the next wave of better applications has been moving very quickly. We have open source. We have many people that are working on different applications. We have Apple, they have a big app store. So there's a lot of interest that people have shown, and they can go out and they can just build an app, they can put it out there and people can start to use it and can just become viral. So before we kind of get into really the depth about the AI, I wanted to talk a little bit about the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom framework. It's the Dikw framework. I'm going to assume that you're all very familiar with the framework. In nursing practice specifically, many of the AI models utilize the specific framework to make decisions so that they can affect care delivery. And the Dikw framework really helps the nurse informaticist to determine how data, information, and knowledge are used in the decision-making process. And I will tell you, honestly, I've been in informatics so long, it was a Dikw framework, and we added the W later. So the data is, the Dikw framework really explains that data leads to information, information to knowledge, and knowledge to wisdom. And you can kind of think of like the AI and the modeling pieces as the wisdom part of this. So data, it really has little or no meaning in isolation from other factors. The information includes the data plus the meaning. The knowledge is derived by discovering patterns and relationships between types of information, and wisdom really brings understanding and internalization of the knowledge patterns and the relationships. And that's really what's key. And that's where we want to get with AI. So in many cases, the AI models, they're paired with clinical decision support applications to help practitioners so they can advance from knowledge to wisdom. So if you think about an example in practice would be like a blood pressure, there's a certain number, there's a rule built behind the number, and then there's a flag, say for like elevated blood pressure. You can look at how practitioners can strategically evaluate the relationships between the AI and the clinical decision support, but they're not the same thing. So just to be, just really want to call out the differences here. So clinical decision supports provides a clinician with a computer generated clinical knowledge and patient related information. It's intelligently filtered and it's presented at the appropriate time to enhance patient care. So if I have a flag set for a systolic blood pressure of 140 and it's 142, I get a flag. Or if I have even a laboratory result like a potassium that's greater than 5.0 and I skip 5.1 and I'll see a flag. On the other hand, artificial intelligence can really be thought of more of the fuel that powers the more intelligent clinical decision systems. So if you think about AI, it generally refers to machines that respond to stimulation that's consistent with traditional responses from humans. So given the human capacity, things like contemplation, judgment, and intention, these machines help make these decisions that normally require human level expertise. So when I get into the Dikw kind of strategic plan, you can see that the framework is relevant when you're designing the clinical decision support tools. And these can help advance the nursing practice so that they can work top of license to improve their nurse decision making. The Dikw framework can be used to categorize the clinical decision support tools, and including those that are driven by AI. So it's a pyramid, and that's why you saw on the table prior the explanation, were essentially from the bottom up. And so as you're looking at the pyramid, it really implies that data is more profuse and wisdom is rare. So that's really what we're trying to go for. And I kind of talked about that data has little or no meaning in isolation, and information is the data, plus meaning knowledge is derived essentially by discovering the patterns and the relationships between the types of information. And then wisdom is understanding and internalization of the knowledge patterns and relationships. So the Dikw framework isn't just a way to understand how information is processed, it's also a means by which providers can strategically evaluate relationships between the AI and the clinical decision support. So when you look at the pyramid and you kind of look at the illustration around the hierarchical nature, you can see that the AI and the CDS applications, they have the data capture to data processing. They can meet the information needs and the clinical knowledge based on the rules to guide the decision making, and then expose the analytics in the form of wisdom to augment the nurse decision making. So from a clinical user perspective, the bottom three levels of the application usually aren't visible. The user only sees the top, the fourth level, in the form of that alert or that dashboard or that risk score application or some other interface. But when you are working right as a nurse informaticist and investigating, or as a nurse leader investigating the AI or the CDS application, it's really essential to understand how all the levels were developed and validated. So if you kind of look at how we go up the pyramid, you can see that at the wisdom part, that's the clinical interpretation. So there's a lot of varieties and a lot of examples of the different clinical interpretations that can occur. The importance of this is just that you understand that the nurse isn't going to see the under layers. They're going to see the top layer. And that really should be your long-term strategy. The long-term strategy should be to get to wisdom. How do we get to the clinical interpretation with all of the data that we have? Is there any questions that I have up until now? I didn't know if there was, I saw the chat, but I can't really see the actual chat. Mary, is there any question that's pertinent right now? You're on mute, Mary.
There are no questions, but I'll monitor the chat for you.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Sorry.
No worries.
And I have 3 monitors. You think I could figure out this Zoom thing? I'm just saying, it's a Zoom thing. It's my struggle. So AI, I believe, is really going to be able to change the way people interact with their surroundings. So I'm going to talk a little bit about AI in healthcare, how AI can potentially enable organizations, no matter the size, right? We need to be talking about AI regardless of how large or small an organization is, because we want to be able to achieve those better business results, and we want to be able to maximize the trends I talked about. Remember, we've got this huge amount of data, we've got massive computing power, and we've got all these algorithms and tools and apps that we're able to use, right? So I'm going to do just a couple of brief, definitions and kind of move forward with a little bit more. And I know some of you are more advanced than others, so you might think this is a little bit more detailed than you want, but I was trying to meet the needs of the audience. Mary and I prepped a little bit, so I just wanted to make sure. So if we, essentially what we're looking at is, the leader's guide to writing the new age of intelligent health system, their definition. So AI, artificial intelligence, is an area of computer science that emphasizes the creation of machines that work and react like humans. So this means that systems that have the ability to depict or mimic human brain function, including learning, speech, recognition and generation, problem solving, vision, and knowledge generation. So keep that definition in mind as we move forward. So I'm going to kind of cut through a little bit of these a little bit. So learning is the ability of the technology to learn and become smarter over time. And that's really important to know. That's what happens with these models. It's not a one and done, like a rule that you write and then that's it with the rule. This is that they become smarter over time. And that's what really separates AI from just intelligent automation. And one of the reasons why AI is so promising is because that it changes the paradigm in how we have been writing software code. So instead of programming every if, then, except condition, essentially telling a computer engine what to do, AI tells the computing engine to learn and figure it out on their own. So that's what's really powerful about this. And then reasoning allows the AI technology to extract the critical information from the really large sets of structured and unstructured data. So that's really important because we know we have all these, structured and unstructured data, perform clustering analysis and use statistical inferences in a way that starts to approach human cognition. And then the cognition allows AI technologies to form conclusions with imperfect data, right? We know our data is not always perfect. And then the interacting allows the AI technology to use computer vision to see, conversational AI to communicate, and computational linguistics to read, and again, getting closer to the human level of cognition. So just a couple of examples how AI essentially has been deployed. So AI allows machines to show capabilities that are typically associated with human intelligence. So the picture on the left, it actually shows an agent that's kind of navigating itself through a maze game. And the picture on the right, the agent is actually learning how to walk. So you can see it's learning how to walk, it's learning how to duck, it's learning how to go over a speed bump. So there's just 2 very brief examples. When we talk about machine learning, and in healthcare, a lot of times machine learning and AI are used interchangeably. So, it just happens, and, just make sure that you understand the context of the person that you're talking to. Machine learning is a type of AI that learns and improves without human intervention, and as it processes data to predict the things that we care about. So ML is considered a very narrow part of AI, and ML needs to look at many examples when learning to solve the task. So expanding on the primary concepts of AI, where machines show capabilities that are usually associated with human capabilities, you can see how learning over time, interpreting data, and reasoning with data works. And then in addition, machine learning creates algorithms that are varying from simple linear functions to extremely complex ones, like an artificial neural network. So instead of manually creating an algorithm, we train it with lots of pairs of inputs and outputs. The result is called a model, and the model can be applied to new inputs to get the output. So you can kind of see the traditional programming on the top where we put in and we get a result. But on the bottom with machine learning, we have input, we have an idea of the desired result, but the program is going to actually come up with the result. So that's really the big difference. One example of this would be like a business intelligence software that collects and transforms massive amounts of data to inform business decisions, just as one example. And then as we're building a model, the model is just a function, just like any other function. So the difference is what we're trying to do is learn the parameters of that function from all of the data that we have. And that's what the machine learning is. So it takes a variety of the different algorithms and techniques to take all of that data and learn the parameters for that function. So how do we do that? Essentially, we typically use some type of computer language like a Python or an R, and frameworks like a scikit-learn. But that's actually how data scientists build models. And I want to be really clear here. I can write a little bit of SQL, but I don't write any other these programming languages. And there's many to choose from. Usually the developing team just selects the language that they're most comfortable writing and how they want to compose the algorithm. So I don't get into that deep detail with how they're doing it. I come up with the problem, what solution we're trying to go for, and then they help me on the back end to write that for me. So the model, what the model does, it really does this as a function, right? So there's 3 different categories that I show here. There's many more, but this is just to give you an example. So we could do regression, we could do classification or clustering. Regression is most commonly remembered. I'm sure everybody remembers it from school. I remembered it from school. I have got a bunch of data. I want it to fit in a line or a curve to that data. And the way that we do that is we look at all of the data points, we do some math, we derive parameters. For example, here it's M and B. And then for this equation, we're trying to draw a line. And that's what machine learning is doing. It's going through and finding what are the right parameters. And then the second machine learning or another machine learning is classification, which is given an input, what class does it belong to? And a really common example here is image classification. Is it a dog, a cat, or a tiger? And so I have a lot of pictures of dogs, cats, and tigers, and then I do some math on that, create a function. And it can take any picture, including those I've never seen before, and make a prediction. So really, it's just a prediction right on that classification. And we don't know, we don't have to just do classification on images. We can do classification on patients. So if you think about the different characteristics that make up a patient. And then the final type of work that I just want to talk about this model is around clustering, which is trying to understand and segment all of our customers or all of our patients and discover what are the different clusters of those patients. For example, search is a clustering problem, which is given a keyword or given an article. How do I find other articles that are related to this topic? And how do we teach the machine to go and do that? So that's really what it takes to build a model. Obviously, I'm not a data scientist, and there's a lot of work that goes into that, but it's what the model does, and that's how we can go and use it and do the regression or do the classification or do a clustering. But that's not the only part of the problem. Every time I've talked about the model, I hope that you've picked up or talked about machine learning, I've talked about data. So there's no machine learning without the data. So a huge part of the machine learning problem is finding the right data, shaping it, cleaning it, and preparing it, and then going out and building and training the model. And then what you have to do is actually go and do something with the model. So these are 3, we kind of look at 3 stages of machine learning. So we find our data, we prep the data, and then we build and we train the model, and then we deploy the model. So I'm going to touch very briefly on deep learning. So there's a lot of buzz about deep learning, and deep learning really refers to the way to build models, which are used something called a neural network. And one of the really interesting properties of neural networks is as you create deep networks, and so those are lots of layers, and you can actually learn really, really complex functions. And these things perform incredibly well and when operating on unstructured data like images or text or sound. And that's why people like them, because we know we have a lot of unstructured data that we need to work with. So now the way that we go and we do deep learning often uses frameworks like a TensorFlow or a PyTorch or a Chainer, and there's a host of others. And one of the really interesting things is that all of the math that's behind the deep learning can actually be accelerated on specialized hardware like a GPU, a graphical processing unit, or an FPGA, which is a filed programmable gate array. If you ever hear those terms, just know that you've heard them in the past, and that's specialized hardware. And it has a lot of power behind it, and that's why we can start to do these models, right? So we need to understand that the more data we have and the more models we build, we need to have better hardware and we need to have better cloud, right? So again, I'm just going to go back to the reason why we're talking about this now and why it's really a hot technology and why we're we're learning about it. And one of the most important things is that we have more data, we have more compute, and there's a major innovation in the algorithms and the tools and the frameworks. And this is really happening because the next wave of making better applications, making more personalized service and experiences is getting powered by insights gained from machine learning. So those are just some kind of basic premises that might be of value to know a little bit about around AI and machine learning. But then we get into AI for healthcare, and when we refer to AI in the context of health, we typically do mean machine learning. And the AI ML components are individual pieces in the bigger health systems. And these combine the big data, the cloud computing, and the emerging devices and user interfaces. I'm sure you're all very familiar with that. And AI, I believe, will enable organizations, regardless of your size, by maximizing those three trends that I already talked about: massive data, massive compute, and breakthrough algorithms. So I'm going to just kind of talk a little bit about kind of like the worldview that I have within my organization. So essentially, Microsoft developed a strategy that's called the Intelligent Edge. And that really means that the underpinning of the strategy has these key differentiators. So one is ubiquitous computing. We have a cloud. It provides consistency for programming models, for data services, for AI, for DevOps. We have the artificial intelligence, so we can really have the contextual insight from the edge providers. So if you look at the intelligent edge, all these devices that are connected to the cloud, and these include all of your devices within your organization, as well as all the personal devices that all of our patients and all of our consumers have. And then it's multi-sense and multi-device experiences, right? So we need to be able to understand the context that surrounds people and places and things, their activities, their relationships. So the edge is really powered by the cloud, and you can do the edge a couple of ways. We have power on our phones, or that could be loaded in the cloud. Like everyone has like the iPhone, your photo cloud, right? Because you have a lot of data within your photos, and you don't want it all in your devices and things like that. What we're finding is that there is a blend of the physical and digital worlds, especially with devices and sensors. So we really need to be able to build on the contextual insights of how we're leveraging those devices. So in the bigger picture within healthcare, there's really a lot of uses for AI, and these are just a few examples. So the clinical analytics, essentially they generate the insights and improve treatments and outcomes. This could include things like clinical pathway prediction, disease progression prediction, health risk prediction, predict risk scoring, virtual assistants embedded into workflows. Conversational AI is a big one, right? Clinical ambient experience. We have operational analytics that are around improving the effectiveness and efficiency of systems to provide and manage care processes. This includes things like predicting operational issues, tracking safety metrics, maintaining equipment, monitor supply chain, and identify fraud. I will say we really learned a lot about the brokenness of our supply chain within healthcare due to COVID. Right, all around the PPE, which is really sad because there are some great examples of supply chain that work really, really well. So we've learned a lot from, I believe, from our retail and our manufacturing verticals that we've brought into our healthcare vertical at Microsoft, because we've learned that we really need to be able to help that, and it's really important. And then behavioral analytics as well, to examine the consumer behaviors to inform our healthcare delivery. So there's three things that we can kind of be done to bring AI to organizations. So you can create intelligent applications, you can optimize business processes, both horizontal and vertical, as well as empower employees through artificial intelligence. So when we consider and think about AI, it really moves beyond business intelligence and kind of realizes this idea of advanced analytics. And that's why we're really going from the left to the right here and going up in an upwardly mobile. So going from what happened, why did it happen, to what will happen, and how can we make it happen? So really, we're essentially going from hindsight and insight to foresight. And the advanced analytics in health leads to new paradigms for patient care and provider ability to care for their patients. So when we're looking to bring AI to every employee, you need to understand both how the employees consume AI and how new AI models have the potential to turn all employees into into citizen data scientists. So there's really this ability to be self-serve, low code. So how can we really optimize what our employees are doing so that they can understand the data that they have and better action on it for their patients? So some of these new paradigms, they look a little bit differently. We'll really look to leverage real-time predictive analytics to shape outcomes. We'll be able to provide research on demand to connect all of the devices to databases. And then ultimately, we'll try to erase the historical boundaries to the data. So the data's coming in, the users want to use it, and they want to get to it fast. And that's really what happens, right? There's this delay currently many times where a user will need the data, but they'll have to wait for a report to run. They by that time, or they have a research question, they ask the question, then another question happens and they have to go back. So we're really looking to make this the more of a real-time predictive to shape outcomes. So if we erase these boundaries to the data, we can really use the data for many things. We can use it for prevention. We can identify patients at risk for disease, detecting changes in patients' medical conditions, diagnoses to enable more accurate and faster diagnoses and treatment. We can customize the treatment plans for individual patients through the use of AI. So it really gives us a field of study that allows it gives the computer the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. So there's many cognitive services that I kind of already spoke about. You can see there's, kind of a listing here around vision and speech and language and knowledge and search. And there's many underneath of these, and there's many more that happen. There's just too many that you can actually really pull in. So if you think about, if you have the cloud and you have all these services, the cloud has leveraged the ability of all these services, then you can take advantage of them as you're looking at your problem and identifying your solution. So really, ultimately, in my thought, it's around going from systems of engagement and systems of record to systems of intelligence. And that's really the promise of AI. How can we transform our clinical services, engage our patients and consumers, optimize operations, and empower our clinicians and employees? And you can see that really kind of runs into the quintuple aim that we talked about early on. So I'm just going to stop here a second and see, Mary, is there any questions?
I don't see any questions, but either now or later, I wonder if you could speak to, can our organizations, patients, nurses, providers, administration, adapt to the speed of this technology?
I do believe they can, because I feel like we did it during COVID, right? We had to with many things with COVID. So we've proven we can do it. It's just a matter, are they willing to? And I think that, frankly, we have to leverage AI in order as a helper to the nurse, especially, right? I'm really bullish on conversational AI to get the nurses away from the clicking and the typing. And how we can do it, I don't know yet. I'm trying to figure that out. So I definitely feel we can do it. I think it's education obviously will be required, but this group on the phone, y'all are going to do it, right? Because it's going to end up falling to you, right? People are going to say, I don't understand it. Can you help me? You're going to be like me. Someone said to me, I don't understand the difference between AI and clinical decision support. Can you explain it to me? And that's how it will start a conversation. So hopefully that helps, Mary.
Yeah, absolutely. Keep going. You're doing a great job.
Yeah, I think, Kathleen, though, the frustration that nursing will always have and will continue to have is that these services a lot of times can be very expensive. And from what I have seen, the places that AI has been used successfully thus far in healthcare is for reading radiology images, right? I think I have that. And it's frustrating because I have worked on a project that uses predictive analytics, and it was half-baked and not well done. And it was because it came with our vendor product, and it would have helped enormously if it worked well. But because it wasn't a perfect solution, it was a little frustrating. And what we could really use is a way to evaluate patients so we can start preventing pressure injuries and all of the all of the happy and the hacks, and that could easily be done with some kind of AI, right? But I think it's just taking a really long time to get those products and to get them where they're actually usable and meaningful and work within the nurse's workflow.
So there's a lot to unpack there, Deborah, and I appreciate the question for sure. First off, so radiology is leaps and bounds ahead of everyone with AI, because they moved to digital, right? Radiographs even when I was in clinical, we were using PACS, and that was in the 90s. So they had a big head start, and there is a lot that goes on around. That's computer vision. So computer vision is pretty solid. I'm not saying it's 100%, but they definitely have that. The other thing I think is we just have to be really honest. We're all nurses on the phone, right, Mary? Are we most all nurses on the phone, Mary?
Yes.
As nurses, we are part of the bed, right? We are not recognized as a, income earner within the organization. So I think I would say that your vendor was incorrect. Your vendor should have engaged you, Deborah, to help with those model building. The models out of the box were not going to be successful, and you need to have input into that. And we need to bring our voice. And part of our bringing our voice is being educated on the subject so that you feel comfortable having those conversations and saying that. So I feel that we have a long way to go. I'm not saying it's perfect by any means. I'm just saying that we need to exercise our influence and, really push hard back on and I'm a vendor, and I respect when people push back and say, no, we're not comfortable with this. How can we do it better? But to me, it's that we're going to see it, and and it's a strategy. Your organization is making these strategically. This is not, I'm a nurse and I decide I'm going to go out and I'm going to build a predictive model for, bed ulcers. I actually have a customer that they went out and they built 30 different predictive models, and that's one of them, right? Pressure ulcers is one of their models, and they've rolled it out to their hospitals, but it was done through their innovation office. And that was a strategic level. They made a cloud decision with it. They made, they decided that, what they were going with, all their different tooling that they were going to use. So I think, Deborah, our responsibility is to keep them honest, right, that they deploy. And it's going to be difficult, but this group, your responsibility, if you choose to accept it, right, with great power comes great responsibility, is that you have to work with those clinicians and help them to understand it. And if there are issues, you need to address those issues.
No, believe me, we do. And they're with it. I'm just saying this is the frustrating part of being
totally
part of the bed cost, right?
Mm-hmm.
And believe me, we advocate, and I work for a large organization, and there is a lot of support structure for it. But I think honestly, the models, they're not there yet to build in to the workflow and to become like a tool that fits seamlessly into the nurse's workflow.
Yep, totally understand. And I'm glad that you have that power in your organization, Deborah. That's awesome to hear, because I've talked to a lot of staff, a lot of nurse informaticists, and they are just doing tickets for the EMR. They haven't even gotten to predictive modeling yet. So it's really good to hear. So I'm going to continue forward and keep me honest, Mary, on time. Let me look at the time here.
Absolutely.
Keep me honest on the time, okay? So I wanted to talk a little bit about, this is actually framed up by within my organization, but it's really the AI maturity model. So you can kind of look at your organization. So this Deborah, might be applicable to your organization, right? To see, like where it is within it. But remember that it's really an operational model. It helps you kind of assess your own attributes and, where you are in the adoption curve. It's designed to really gather the information related to the core characteristics that are required. Because remember, in my mind, it's people, process, and technology. You can't just put the technology out there. You've got to have the people in the process. How are you going to get it out there? How are you going to get people using it? It can't be a black box. We know that. Like, clinicians want to understand what goes into that model. So this is really around helping guide the adoption for the right AI technologies at the right time. And then additionally, we have some my organization has like prescriptive guidance that's associated with adopting the right AI technologies within your current maturity level. So we actually do this whole assessment. We advise on how to increase your maturity and then how to embrace and advance to the AI capabilities. So obviously, Deborah, was a good segue, right? There's a lot of challenges and there's a lot of risks. We need to be aware of them. For widely adopted technology, it's got a lot of power and a lot of potential. It can be pervasive, but we have to understand that benefits have challenges and risks, and they have to be managed and mitigated. So you can see here some of the challenges. It really has to be interdisciplinary effort. We have got to engage with clinicians. I've seen many a failure where the data scientist said, here's your model, go and deploy it, and then it does not meet the need. What problem are you trying to solve? I never talk about a product ever, and I always talk about the problem, because that's really what we need to address. And I talk with organizations all the time, and they say, I have a lot of big rocks and a lot of little pebbles. And I'm like, okay, where do you want to start? And you have to kind of like figure out, understand that data, it's siloed, it's unstructured, it could be manual entry. There's a lot of nuances to data. We've got to understand the privacy considerations, because we know that, data, especially when we're dealing with PPI and PHI, it's highly confidential. And then we have this huge interoperability issue. And I don't know that we're as far along as we really want to be, even with everything that's going on with TECFA from the ONC. We really have an interoperability problem within healthcare. I can go to any bank in the world and I can stick my card in and I can get some kind of money out. But I can't go to two hospitals and I recently, Mary knows, I recently fell and fractured my femur. I went to one hospital, I went to another hospital, and they don't talk to each other. So I had to give my own report when I got there, because the nurse said she had a crappy report. And I said, I'll tell you, come on in, I'll tell you what happened. And then we have the whole risks, right? We could be exacerbating societal biases. And we know that we have these societal biases that exist. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. We have the loss of jobs require training for new skills. So if you don't have the right skill set within your organization, and then lack of regulatory oversight, that can be truly a risk. So you need to have a good governance structure for your data. So we have essentially 6 principles that we really believe that guide AI development and use. So for fairness, we really have to understand how bias can be introduced into the AI model before making the recommendations. We need to attract a diverse pool of AI talent to research before we implement. So we need to develop analytical techniques that detect and eliminate bias. We need to conduct human review, and we need to recruit resources that have domain expertise. That's you guys, right? You have that domain expertise. For reliability and safety, we need to rely on evaluating our training data. We have to test it extensively with user feedback. We need to monitor ongoing performance, and we need to choose designs that are vetted for anticipation of unexpected circumstances. For security and privacy, we must ensure compliance with existing privacy laws, provide transparency and choices when making decisions regarding the data collection and the use, and we need to research de-identification techniques to promote safe and crucial data. De-identification can be really problematic. There are some great vendors out there that do de-identification, as well as some good tools, but we have to be very wise to that. We need to have inclusiveness. So we have to address potential barriers that could unintentionally exclude people, look for technological opportunities for those with disabilities, and build trust by sharing contextual interactions and improvements of AI. We need transparency. So you must make sure that you let your stakeholders know how decisions were made, invest in AI where manufacturers also value transparency, and encourage staff to raise awareness of potential bias, errors, and unintended outcomes without causing fear. And then accountability. We need to really create a plan for a continual review of the best technology and potential issues, develop internal review boards, and be accountable before AI is introduced, and maintain that accountability moving forward. So these are our core principles, and they're the cornerstone of our responsible and our trustworthy approach to AI. So some of the concerns of AI, as I mentioned, we recognize those 6 principles, right? Fairness, reliability, safety, privacy and security, inclusiveness, transparency, and accountability. So because these are our cornerstone, and we really have to have a trustworthy approach to AI. We have to be really recognize that every individual and every company and region kind of has their own beliefs and standards, and they should be reflected in their AI journey. So we want to make sure that we share our perspective so that you can kind of consider when you're developing your own guiding principles. So, you know, whether it's under representation in the data sets, or the bias or unfairness that already exists in the imperfect world, AI can make incorrect assumptions. However, part of our responsibility as leaders, right, is to be aware of this possibility and strategically plan to adopt AI that treats everyone the same. So, you know, there's a lot of articles out there about biases that have occurred and how outcomes have been changed within healthcare. So we really have to make sure that we're conscious of that and just make sure that we avoid that if at all possible. So I have just a couple of bias examples, which I think are pretty interesting. We know AI is not infallible, and it can fail big and it can fail often. So I think that if we keep this in mind, you know, they have their own set of problems as tools. So we have to really be careful that when we use it widely, that the blind spot of the model becomes the blind spot for all the users, and we don't want to over rely on these models, right? So this case study is around predicting pneumonia, right? It's a model that was built to predict the probability of death for patients with pneumonia that were high-risk patients that could be admitted to the hospital, while low-risk patients were treated as outpatients. And the machine learning model essentially performs well on the task, but when there was closer inspection, it revealed that on one data set, the model learned that the patient who has asthma was identified as lower risk. Now, we're clinicians, right? So we all know, what? Like, that's kind of crazy. So why did the model, you know, learn that this really obviously wrong relationship? So the reason that this occurred is because it reflected the true pattern in the training data. So there were two things that happened. Patients with a history of asthma, they presented with pneumonia and were essentially directly admitted to the ICU. And the aggressive care they received in the ICU lowered their risk of dying from pneumonia compared to the general population. And then there was an incidental finding from the research. This was a research study, so this was not deployed into true care. This was all done through modeling. Incidental finding was that patients with asthma, when they weren't feeling good and they started having breathing difficulties, they actually presented earlier than potentially a patient without asthma. So that was one of the other incidental findings. But what happened was the model trained on the data incorrectly learned that asthma lowers risk. So when in fact, we know that asthmatics have a much higher risk if they're not hospitalized. So this could happen for a couple of reasons. So the providers were proactive in admitting the asthma patient to the ICU. Asthma patients were aware of the condition. They presented a little bit earlier because of their illness. And I only showed this example because we need to be aware, and there are actions that we can do. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those actions. So we definitely need to have more research on the AI and ML fairness for existing models. This could include investments in interpretable models and causal models. AI should be agile enough to adapt to the changes in the clinical setting, right? We have, you know, very adaptable setting. For example, the same model should not be applied across settings in which workflows and policies are different. So if you have acute care and intensive care, they may not be applicable the same. And then the goal of effective AI really should be to aid in decision-making, not replace the clinician participation. And AI users should be confident and know that whatever recommendations are presented and how to use them in their clinical practice. So there's a few questions, you know, that we can ask about the potential AI and CDS tools and using the Dikw framework. So we're going all the way back to what we talked about at the beginning of this talk. So it's really, if you look through the data and information, knowledge and wisdom, and you go back to the pyramid, you can see that there's, you know, quite a few questions that maybe we need to talk about. So it's important to understand the required data sources, as well as the types of transformations that are performed on the data that may change the clinical meaning, right? So we know that people massage the data, so we need to understand that. There's essentially cutoffs for how results are categorized. It's important to know if data capture will add any additional burden to clinicians. Also, is there going to be any workflow impact for the clinicians? make sure that the data capture is dynamic and that there's continuous changes. For example, forms can be updated or created or retired. And is there a similar life cycle for the CDS? And is there a way to de-implement? So how can we have that in the planning cycle as well? For information, for example, the same models should not be used across settings, as I mentioned, and ensure that clinicians review the decision support and validate the clinical appropriateness and relevance of the recommendations. For knowledge, the products for AI and CDS, the products of the model are only as good as the data and the information that helped create it. And for wisdom, the goal of effective AI and CDS should be to aid in decision-making, not replace clinician participation. And it will not be effective if clinicians don't understand how the recommendations are produced. So we want to make sure we have continuous and effective training required so that we're confident with the AI and the CDS that users know what recommendations represent and how to use them in their clinical practices. And that kind of brings us to some ethical questions to consider. So, what is the planning to thoroughly stress test the AI for unintended bias? Is the context of bias in AI? In that context, a model needs to reflect socially responsible values. So the developers of the AI tools and the healthcare teams, they need to identify and take steps to address the bias, avoid introducing or exacerbating healthcare disparities when testing or deploying new AI tools on vulnerable populations. And are we effectively identifying and managing the ethical implications? Can we explain how the AI makes decisions using the data? So we need transparency in the AI algorithm in order to understand what went into it and why, and can the model be explained? There's a whole process around explainability of data models. It's a very complicated and very complex issue. There could be a whole hour on explainability, to be honest with you. So providers are going to try to seek insights into what the AI is doing, and they are not going to accept the black box. We've all heard about the black box because that involves patient safety, quality, and outcomes. They want to know what goes into that model. We need to be able to explain that. And then, is there a clear breakdown of how the adoption of AI is going to adhere to the fundamental principles of managing AI in an ethical way? AI will only produce results as good as the data that's available to it. And with the vast amount of data that's coming in from multiple disparate systems, it's really critical that organizations have an effective data governance strategy, which I mentioned previously, just so that you can maximize the full potential of the information assets and then the potential of the AI. So there's a few tips for to really enable care teams to advance the AI responsibility. So for demanding non-discrimination, AI needs to reflect socially responsible values. As I talked about in the ethical discussion, we need to make sure that we don't teach AI to be biased. Especially if research is being conducted. The model should not discriminate against people for any reason, and developers of the tools really need to identify and take steps to address the bias and avoid introducing or exacerbating the disparities that we know exist. We need to be able to protect the patient. Privacy is really a key concern, and it affects how the AI is developed and tested. So privacy really reflects the nature of the provider's relationship with the patient, and individual privacy must be protected at all times. We need to investigate the AI algorithm, so transparency in the AI algorithms necessary to understand what went into it and why, and can the model be explained, as I mentioned, with explainability. And then in order to check the data, AI will only produce results as good as the data available to it. So we talked about the governance previously. So, people hear about, or clinicians, or, in general, people hear about AI and they get kind of like freaked out and they think that someone's going to come in and take over their job. So really it's about tasks, not jobs. So when employees and clinicians hear AI and they jump to the image of the robot doing their jobs. I was actually at a webinar or as a panel, and it was a bunch of nurses in New York City, and they were all face to face for the first time, and they talked about robots, and they asked them, raise your hand if you're worried about the robots coming in and taking your job, and almost all of them raised their hand. I was totally shocked, because I don't feel that is going to happen, right? There's too much that nurses bring to the table besides just doing tasks. So in the development of AI for use in clinical delivery and administrative tasks, we want to make sure that we have clinician and staff input in how the AI can best help them do their jobs and can advance the responsible use of AI. Essentially, in the future, Many jobs are going to require some level of digital skills, and staff are only going to be trained, and they're going to have to understand how to work with the AI technologies. Upskilling the workforce and teaching new skills as technology affords new opportunities is a priority. And the technology may eliminate the need for special skills previously required to do certain types of work and displace workers. But it's also going to free up time and provide critical information and insights that can create categories of jobs that are much more proactive and effective in helping patients manage their health conditions. Their care and their disease managers, expanded telehealth services, community health workers, those are just a few. So we really need to be able to build like the smarter healthcare workforce using AI. And this is going to require a change to the nature of health staff work at hospitals or health systems. We need to understand the skills and competencies that will be needed to be changed, the new AI positions and technical talents that will be needed. Leaders will need to be required to prioritize AI projects. Leaders are going to need to know enough about AI to work effectively with the larger ecosystem. There's going to be required a culture change to embrace innovation and technology, and barriers to adoption will need to be overcome with skill management and planning. And I talk a lot with organizations now, especially that we're in this workforce crisis, around upskilling. And it's across the board. It's not just their licensed personnel, it's also their non-licensed personnel as well. So there's some critical success factors for AI integration, and you can see that it's really this multidisciplinary team approach that comes up to the forefront. AI is technology, but implementation should not fall strictly to the realm of the IT department. So it's not only a technology change, it's a people change. So you need to have designated multidisciplinary team working together as equals to ensure everyone is considered. The change management approach should articulate the purpose, demonstrate how AI supports organization strategic goals, and identify the key people affected and effectively communicate the progress. The healthcare organization has to have culture change, right? So they have to be able to successfully integrate AI into the workforce and have a culture that embraces innovation and technology. And that culture starts at the top of the organization with the executive team. And usually when I'm talking to organizations, I am talking to their executives when they're talking about AI. They identify key AI champions who believe in the power of AI to improve the performance of everyone and have them amplify a culture of excitement during integration. Partnering with AI experts will really help you choose the right tasks to transform through AI. And AI should not be looked on with the narrow use cases being integrated into existing systems. Just instead develop an overall approach to the needed workforce and workflow changes. I think AI is going to be huge for automating manual processes, especially as we see this shortage continue on and on, especially on the nursing front. It's just getting to the point of no return. The workflow to make integration as seamless as possible. So the new AI technology must fit into the user's existing workflows, not make it more difficult by making users log into another system or adding additional tasks. So if the purpose is to enhance the person's ability to do their job, then it has to be easy to use. And we've all seen that, right? Nurses will be the first one to say, I'm not doing that. Because the risk that you run is that you'll have done all this work and they're just simply not going to use it. And then the top two priorities for project identification really improve return on investment and staff satisfaction. So if the healthcare organization that you're working in can be successful on both, the odds of being successful for implementation are much higher. So if you think about project identification, so it's applicable to the organization, and then the staff have a buy-in and are satisfied with it, then you have a much higher chance of being successful. Select the tasks that have the highest potential for AI to optimize with the least amount of time, money, and resources. I think, Deborah, you brought up it's expensive, right? And we know that it does cost money, but it's an investment that'll have returns. It just needs to get deployed. And then choose the projects that have the greatest potential to really fundamentally change what someone does for the better. So we really need to help our end users out. I'm just taking a look at the time here, so to make sure. I just want to.
We have about 10 minutes.
Oh, okay. Does that include Q&A or still talking, Mary?
Still talking. We'll give you 10 more minutes.
Okay. So I had told you I had a lot of content. I can always cut at any time. So I just want to have some examples of some emerging cloud and AI applications. Just using the cloud and applying AI can be seen in many ways, right? So we have continuous patient monitoring. We can infuse AI into clinical workflows. So you can look at this as around an image compared and being trained. And then we can also look at deploying interactive health agents. So like a chat bot or a health bot that can be of value. So I actually have some examples, and my examples have videos, but due to timing, I will, I don't think I put the slide in for each, but I can talk about each of these. Let me see if I put the slide in here. No, I didn't put the slide in. I have a slide for each of these. So I'll kind of like talk through each of these from this slide, and I won't change slides. There's multiple use cases that I have that are examples. So I picked out just kind of a select few. So accelerating time to diagnosis, the example is actually the diabetic patient that has at risk for eye disease. And they, instead of going to the ophthalmologist to have their eyes checked, because it's a whole other visit to another office, we have an organization that they have a device that they use that do the measurements, and leveraging artificial intelligence, they actually let the patient know if they're at risk for, I believe it's, oh shoot, I know it's not macular degeneration. It's one of the other eye, oh shoot, it's related to diabetes. So it's high risk for diabetes patients. And what they do is they do images of the back of the eye, and leveraging artificial intelligence, they give them a risk score. And the satisfier is a couple of things. First off, it saves them a visit to the ophthalmologist to get checked. It allows them to have early detection for potential eye disease and loss of vision. And it also increases their compliance. So the benefits to the organization is actually saves money, right? Because they identify these things early and they're able to manage the patient's care better. Preventing the sick from getting sicker is actually an example that leverages Epic as the electronic health record, and it is a predictive model that's built on patient deterioration. And they have had like a essentially, it prevents the patient from going to the ICU. So it keeps the patient on the floor. They have a alert that goes out to the physician that is on call for their critical patients, and they can go and they can evaluate the patient. They usually get an alert about 4 hours prior to the patient declining, so that they have time that they can make the interaction, and they can keep the patient out of going to the ICU or going to a telemetry bed. And the thing that's really neat about that is that they have like diverted many cardiac arrests. Many hospitals use it. The one in the video is actually Ochsner Hospital, and they in Louisiana, and they found that it was pretty interesting when they implemented. I talked to the project manager. When they implemented, they were actually had like, I don't know, it was like 20 hours ahead or something like that. They had to work with the team, right? This is where you have to meet your clinicians where they are. And this was for physicians. And they were alerting the physicians like 20 hours ahead, and they were walking in the patient room. The patient's kind of like, what are you doing here, doc? I feel fine. So they actually narrowed that window down to 4 hours, and they found that was a good amount of time that gave them time to treat the patient, to divert any untoward effects within their health. So that's the use case around preventing the sick getting sicker. Keeping the sick out of the hospital is actually pretty interesting. It's out of Australia, and they leverage the Microsoft HoloLens, and they do a HoloLens video visit with the physician and the patient in their patient home. And the nurse can see, based on the HoloLens, they can actually pull up all of the patient's electronic health record. And they can see the physician, and the physician can see the patient, which is pretty interesting. The patient sees the physician as like a hologram in their home, which is pretty neat. And then, and we realize there's this huge, we could go through a whole nother discussion on hospital at home, right? We know that's a huge shift, and we're seeing that, especially with all the telehealth that happened during COVID. And then detecting disease before it reaches us. This is actually interesting. It's done by Microsoft Research in, I believe it was in South Africa. And what they do is, the whole premise is they need a lot of compute, because they send out these drones, and these drones collect mosquitoes, and they bring the mosquitoes back, and they do DNA analysis of the mosquitoes, looking for bloodborne diseases, right? Mosquito carried bloodborne diseases. Wish we had had something like this during COVID, right? So they are looking at preventing large outbreaks of disease. And the massive amount of compute is required because of the volume of DNA that they have to go through for the number of mosquitoes, for the large number of mosquitoes that they have. So I think that's a really cool, interesting use case, to be honest with you, because I just think there's so much we can do. There's so much possibilities there, right? And, you know, if we could look at our environment and understand in our environment what's going on, and we can leverage that compute and build these different these models, right? And, you know, we're seeing a lot of these models built for COVID, right? We're looking at where different outbreaks are occurring. We're looking at the different variants. So all of those dashboards that you're seeing, a lot of them do leverage AI. So I'm going to just move forward and see. Let me find my slides here. I'm going to just go through a couple of slides because I do want to cover just, I'm going to make sure I skip all of the videos here. A couple of last minute things because I just want to kind of like wrap it up and, you know, just essentially say that as smart as AI is, right, we know that there's certain things that they will not be able to do. So wisdom, reasoning, judgment, imagination, critical thinking, common sense, and empathy. These are all human characteristics. There is never going to be a robot who's going to hold your hand or touch your forehead when you're laying in the hospital bed and you're sick. So I, you know, truly believe that AI is disrupting the health industry. It's going to disrupt it moving forward. There's more research that's necessary. We know that. We need to have policies and regulations to keep up with it. And a lot of these new applications or scenarios, we need to understand how we can prevent the long-term impacts. And then I have just one video. I would like to show this video because this is actually in progress now. Can you hear it okay?
No.
Yeah, I think there's something I need to do in Zoom so that you guys can hear, frankly. Let me see.
Well, if you leave us the links.
I think it's because she's wearing headphones.
Yeah, it's possible.
Oh, you think?
But if you leave the link, we can look at it later.
Okay. All right. So it's actually a very interesting use case. It's called it's a cognitive AI, and it was actually an engineer at Microsoft. He was born blind. And it is essentially how you can use your iPhone. It's an app on Android and on iOS. You can download the app and you can actually have computer vision from your phone. And he built it really for himself with a bunch of engineers at Microsoft because he wanted to have that ability to understand what was going on. And he uses a special glasses called pivot glasses to kind of help him with that visualization. So I'll just end and sum it up because I think we're really out of time. It's really not about quantifying the obvious. It's about opening your minds and processes, discover new things that we have yet to consider. And I did just want to throw out, and Mary, I will send you this link. The Microsoft and AHA, American Hospital Association, there is, we did do an AI in health course. So it's one CEU and it's free. If people are interested in taking that, they're welcome to take it. So I'll end there. Thanks very much. I really appreciate it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. You've given us so much to think about. I'm going to toss out a few comments and questions that people have put in the chat and see if you can speak to it. So B. Mitchell wrote, what are some strategies we can use to encourage nurses and physicians my screen, to adopt predictive analytics? My team and I are currently implementing a product algorithm, so there's a lot of mistrust and primarily based on the algorithms due to a failed attempt with a previous vendor. So how do you engender trust?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Because of the failure. And I tell my team that all the time. We got one shot at this because you kind of have like this black eye when you go in and you're trying to do it. So my question is, you know, who from the provider's team, right? Who are you working with? Is there a trusted advisor that they have on their team that could help you with them? Who's their champion? Are you just going in and saying, here's what we have and you're going to implement it? Or do you have someone from their team that you kind of brought into the fold and they're your trusted champion? That's what I try to do. Trusted advisor. someone they look up to. It doesn't have to be someone on their team. It could even be someone from outside their team who's maybe done it before. But that's a tough challenge, especially when you've had a failure.
Yeah, very hard. So much of this presentation or AI reminds me of where we were at the EHR in the early 90s. You know, there's going to be a big learning curve, and people, you've talked about diagnostics and multiple different technologies. I think because most of the people on this call have come out through healthcare organizations, as Teresa said, you know, we definitely need to get away from the just clicking for documenting. The next generation, the next level of critical thinking should be a form of AI. Do you see anything specific to nursing documentation that you have a use case for?
So, so do you mean like, do I see, maybe I don't understand the question. Do I see how we're going to improve nursing documentation in future?
How specifically could AI be applied to clinical documentation to reduce the burden of documentation?
Yes, so we have it for physicians. So I have to get in the product for this a little bit, Mary, because Microsoft just acquired Nuance Health. So I'm sure you're familiar with Nuance Health. You're familiar with Dragon Medical One, and there's also a product called Dragon Ambient Experience. You can look it up. There's a lot of different, on the web, there's a lot of different examples of it where the patient walks into the clinic, the doctor says, you know, hi, Kathleen, how are you doing? How's your femur fracture going? And it actually does the, and I'm going to get, if this is too much detail, Mary, stop me. And the patient, you know, it's all transcribed, like there's no touching a keyboard or anything, right? Physician driven, right? Physician, doctors. It's a little bit easier for doctors. They do, in general, they do a SOAP note, which is a big text blob. And, you know, it just kind of starts from the top, and then they can go in and they can annotate it. It can go right into your whatever EMR you have, Epic, MyChart, or Epic Chart or whatever. For nurses, okay, I'm going to say we did ourselves a little bit of a disservice. Now we realize in hindsight, we built a flow sheet based on these paper flow sheets, and we have these discrete individual data elements that we need to fill in for our patients. So when we have a patient that comes in for an admission, it's not a big text blob. It's a lot of different discrete elements, and some of them may be like single select or multi-select, because we were making it easier for nurses, right? We didn't want them typing into all those different discrete fields. We just gave them a lot of discrete fields that they have to like click on. So it's a little bit harder, and the back end of it is essentially requires a little bit of a different trafficking of the messages from like that verbal to get it into that, where is it going here? So the good news is I'm pushing really hard for this because I believe that we can learn from what these doctors are doing here with this technology, which is conversational artificial intelligence, and we can use it for nursing. And I'm pushing really hard for that. It is not something that exists today, but we are well aware of the problem. And I actually have had 3 CNOs in the last 2 weeks say, Kathleen, I need Nuance for nursing. Okay, there's no product called Nuance for nursing. I would be really clear here, so don't throw me under the bus if you ask for that. But I'm pushing really hard because, and I'm working now that Nuance and Microsoft are together, I can talk to that team very freely and talk to them about what those needs are. So I think a lot of this is identifying the need, understanding the problem. We don't want our nurses clicking and pointing. They're in the EMR too much time. We need to understand how much are they in the, if I work 720 minutes, a 12-hour shift, am I in the EMR 300 minutes or 500 minutes? Do we even know that? I don't know that we even know those answers. And then of course there's the big understanding of how do we do an evaluation of the EMR? We add all the time. Do we ever take anything away, like from the documentation? And is that something we could leverage AI to help us with? Like, is there a way we could, you know, somehow write some logic that would help us identify, here's a form that we never fill out anymore, or here's a form that in general doesn't apply to everyone. I don't know, like, why does it always show when it's not necessary? But you know, I implemented electronic health records back in 2000s, right? So I've been there. I told providers you're going to be better, faster, and stronger. I didn't know that wasn't true. I really thought what I was saying was true. And I think they were definitely made for regulatory and billing, and we have to help our clinical providers out. And definitely we have to help our nurses out, right? I mean, the doctors seem like they get a lot of help. So let's try to help nurses out.
I think that's a good point. Another comment from Paula: I see the benefit of many of these technologies, But where I think nursing is today is just trying to survive, you know, supporting up to 30% newly licensed nursing. So it's always in the staffing shortage model. How can we advocate to move this forward in the nursing realm? So basically, how do you get or help the CNO? Do they need to redefine their organizations or the healthcare organization in general, such that, you know, you have there is, you know, a group looking at staffing, but how do we bring in that expertise so that they can pull the organization, get that nuance for nursing, build those solutions, but help the nurse leaders understand that's how their organizations have to change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm all about the workforce crisis right now. And I say crisis is a catalyst for innovation. So we need to say, we are here to help you as nurse informaticists, and we have processes. We can leverage the technology. How can we, what it is, you know, how can we leverage this technology? How can we automate these manual processes? When a nurse puts her call aid on, when the patient puts her call aid on, it goes to the nurse, and the nurse goes into the room and they say, I need a blanket. Do I need to send my registered nurse in to get the blanket, or could the patient care tech? So how do we help, you know, do this working at top of license? How do we take away some of these more manual processes? And how do we help upskill those technicians, right? Like I said, a lot of what I'm hearing is that I can't compete with Chick-fil-A that's paying $17 an hour and get a care tech. I actually had someone tell me that. And we know we're investing a tremendous amount of money in staffing. I have organizations tell me all the time there are millions of dollars over budget because of all these travelers.
I'm almost done.
So we have to look at these staffing models. So new models of care impact, you know, if you have experienced nurses that are leaving the bedside, is there an opportunity where maybe we could offer them to mentor remotely these newer 30% of nurses that are coming out? Because we got a lot of brain drain going on, a lot of brain trust that's leaving. And is there a way we can do that with tools and technology, right, that can help with that? Is it a chat bot, you know, that they could, you know, hit the chat bot and say, Kathleen, I don't know how to do a chest tube dressing or whatever it is. How do we get them point of care? You know, how do we leverage the technology to get them their point of care training, right? If someone told me, another CNO told me they have 1,400 agency nurses and they have to get them staffed up. They have to get them ramped up on their policies, their procedures, and their procedures, and they have a big problem with clinical variation of care, right? Because they got all these new people that don't necessarily know organizationally how they should be doing things. So we definitely can leverage technology for those things. It may not be AI, but there's usually AI built into that technology in some way.
I think I mean, all this is excellent. And I will say to the group, I have personally invited Kathleen to come join our clinical education committee, because I think we need her expertise to help us kind of move out of this and bring that expertise to our community. But Michelle Redmond, I'm going to post a comment and read her comment. And she said, I may be dating myself, but with all this technology, what happens to the clinicians' critical thinking skills, assessment, and relationships with our patients? And I think that's so important, because that isn't at the core of who we are as nurses. And I think that, you know, just like the EHR dramatically changed our lives, you know, how can you paint a picture of how AI will improve? Because nurses, I think, are some of the most wary individuals, because we've seen so many of the promises. Some have come true, some have not, and there have been many unintentional consequences. So from your expert perspective, what do you think? How can this really help us spend more time with our patients?
Yeah, I agree. And I'm actually probably one of the biggest, I mean, I am a trauma critical care nurse, right? So I am definitely a more cynical person. I look at this as, you know, the opportunity, because when you think about the skills around critical thinking skills, it's all around the scientific method, right? That's kind of how nurses learn. We learn through the analyzing and applying standards and discriminating and information seeking and logical reasoning and predicting and transforming knowledge. Think of the AI as how can it assist you with those tasks? So I don't know that we will, although I can't say that we won't lose anything because I can't even remember any of my phone numbers anymore, right? Because they're in my phone. I don't have to remember them. So think of those tasks or those things that we don't necessarily need to know right offhand. So think of that skills that are essential for critical thinking, and how can they have the ability to analyze the problem and apply those standards, and how can we kind of offload some of those additional tasks. I don't know that it's a good premise, right? I mean, it will be interesting to see where we are in like 5 or 10 years, where we are with it. But I don't think that I think that we're just going to alleviate some of the brain power for more important things. Right. When that patient comes into the resuscitation unit, I'm going to know what meds to pull and all that. I don't think that is really going to change. I think what we're going to change is this slog through the EHR where I'm in there for hours and I'm just doing it to document because that's the way I always thought I had to do it. Right. We used to document by exception, and now people just document everything, or they do the big copy paste, and we have all this information that we didn't really need to do that. And I think that part of that is retraining, right? Documenting by exception. So hopefully I answered that question.
You did. I mean, it's a hard question to ask. And I think that we're going to have to keep watching best practices to see how people are dealing with these challenges as we evolve. And I said that was going to be the last comment, but I'm going to ask one more because you're there. And I know it's going to be easier getting this information from you. So Andy asks, can you speak to the current regulatory environment for these developing tools? So is the FDA, in my opinion, getting their fingers in this and being
they
a little
are.
more,
Yeah.
Is it not when are we coming out of the Wild West?
Yeah, it's like software as a medical device. So there is this whole move forward, software as a medical device, and Microsoft's all in for that, right? Because we feel like people need to be honest, and we went through the whole ethics and trustworthiness of it, right? So it needs to be explainable. So software as a medical device, there's more to come on that. It was just released, I want to say November, but for some reason I might have that date wrong. I do want to answer John. John said something about artificial intelligence versus augmented intelligence, and I have heard it both, John, and recently actually, so it's not even from a past that long in the past, where some people do think augmented intelligence might be a better way to say it. And I know Vicky Taize, I don't know if you know Vicky, out of the New York HIMSS committee, she actually presented it as augmented intelligence on one of the sessions. I can't remember which one it was. So I think that, just look at it as we're really trying to alleviate the burden and the burnout, and how can AI assist and help us? And that's really the goal. And if conversational AI is the way to go, or a chat bot, or, predictive analytics, or, identifying patients that are at higher risk, so I respond to them more quickly, those things, if that can help us, then I think I'm all in for it. And we need to help our nurses. They're struggling. And I was just a patient recently. So I had a nurse say to me, Kathleen, this is my last day here. I'm going up the street for $7,000 a week. And I was at the hospital where I used to work. So I knew everybody there. So it's really bad out. I mean, you guys know better than I do because you work with the staff every day. But as a patient laying there and having them say, when they wheeled me in on the ambulance and there's 3 other patients and 8 paramedics, and the registrar says to me, do you have a smartphone? And I said, yes. And she says, give me your email. And I gave her my email. She's like, okay, I'm sending you a link, and I need you to click on the link, register yourself. Oh, and by the way, you need to upload the front and the back of your insurance card. I was in excruciating agony with a fractured femur and high on fentanyl. And I will tell you, I'm proud to tell you that I did it. But if I had been my 92-year-old aunt, I would not have been able to do that. We're asking a lot of our patients, and we're asking a lot of our providers. And I think we really need to help them as best we can, wherever we can.
Well, Kathleen, the questions still are coming. So I think what I'm going to do is I might shoot them off to you, and sure, I will share them. You can get back to us. And I just wanted to thank you for a wonderful evening. I think that one of the comments, someone said they never made the connection between nuance and nursing. So that in and of itself alone, I think is phenomenal.
I'm trying so hard. I'm trying really hard.
Yeah, I know we'll be talking. Best. This is the hot topic. This is where we're going. So I think we are the group along with our peers across the country, to really bring
Excellent.
AI to nursing.
Well, I appreciate all of you for being out there on the front lines. I think it's tremendous what you're doing. I did put the AHA, the course in for AI. You just have to register, but you don't have to pay anything. And they're a great partner, and the AHA realizes we've got to get nurses and leaders educated on artificial intelligence. So thank you so much. I really appreciate everybody, your attention. And I know it was a lot of content in a short period of time. I tried to do my best to whittle it down for you guys.
Well, thank you so very much. Well, I'll give you our thumbs up and applause, our emoticons. Awesome. Thanks, awesome. Kathleen. We'll be in touch.
Thanks, Mary. Take care.